I'm an Afghan. I've always been an Afghan. What's happening is not like a US/NATO defeat and like them succumbing to that or conceding to that and pulling out and absolute chaos like reigning over. It's a calculated plan to position the Taliban into a form of government to cater to American interests, to really offset the threat posed by Russia, China, and Iran. And so now again, we're being used as a puppet state again. And that's been the case. This is the third time. And my parents are seeing it for the third time in their lives.
Welcome back to another very special episode of The Radical Narrative. I'm your host, Milan Tatusis. For many of you who follow me on social media, you know by now that I did contract COVID-19 via the Delta variant. I did have the Delta variant and I'm completely normal, completely fine. Vaccines worked, masking worked. I did contract it in a public space in Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan's a trip right now for all you Eastern and Western listeners on the coasts who are taking COVID-19 seriously where you're living. Out here, people aren't wearing masks. Out here, it sounds like it's an option to self-isolate if you do get it and you are double vaxxed, but there are breakthrough cases. I was a breakthrough case. That is unfortunate. I did manage to contain the spread. It stopped with me. My children are safe. My family's safe. Everybody is safe. I did go into a 2-week isolation all by myself. Couldn't work on any podcasts, couldn't work on any content, was basically just meditating and focusing on the positive. So all our listeners out there, be sure to take COVID-19 seriously. Be sure to take the Delta variant seriously. I worry because we're getting into the fall semester. I am teaching a university class. As y'all know, I'm also a PhD candidate. I am teaching a class on campus and it is concerning, but I do have some Delta immunity, ideally. Some of y'all may not. Some of y'all may have youngsters at home. And of course, as we all know, as Indigenous people, you know, our children come first. I'm really not liking how people are just cut and pasting what Western society is doing in context to responding to a freaking pandemic, right? I always wondered, how is it that viruses spread in early colonization? Like, what were we doing wrong as a people? Why didn't we just isolate and not connect with each other? Because obviously we could draw correlations and see patterns emerge, but here we are, same people doing the same thing, 500 years of colonization and diseases, and yeah, still randoms out there, raw dogging their face to the world. I want y'all to survive because I want y'all to keep liking, subscribing, and sharing to the Radical Narrative. All jokes aside, take it seriously. Take it seriously. With that being said, today is a very special episode because, as we all know, we've been observing what we've been hearing on the news and seeing on the news in regards to Afghanistan, that the U.S. military is, in quotations, pulling out of the country. And for a lot of us, all we get to see and hear about is the settler colonial portrayal of Afghanistan. We see what they want us to see, we hear what they want us to hear, and it's unfortunate that we aren't hearing Afghan voices in some of these conversations. And if we are, we're hearing a very sanctioned, very sanitized version of what's taking place. So I reached out to a friend online who I follow on Instagram, and it just so happened, by the grace of the creator, she was passing through Saskatchewan on her way to the Rocky Mountains, and she agreed to sit down with me. So today I'm sitting down with Lema Ijetmaye, an Afghan woman in the diaspora. She really breaks down what's taking place in her home country, on her homelands, and I give her space to talk about what she wants to talk about, and really she informed me and taught me a lot. Not only that, but we get to have conversations about settler colonialism, anti-capitalism, Marxism, US imperialism, and ultimately how we need to think more critically about what's taking place globally, but also within the settler colonial state of Canada. I get to talk about Indigenous governance. We talk about electoral politics and the big spoof that the NDP is trying to pull on our people and BIPOC people in general. It was just an amazing conversation. I really want y'all to listen to this and share with me your thoughts on it. We sat down and had this conversation socially distanced outside. It was an impromptu setup and we got it all on the recording, which is great. So put up with some of the technical difficulties. It was the best we could do in a pinch, while wearing masks. So sit back, relax, keep your eyes on the road if that's what you're doing, and stay tuned and listen in. But yeah, I do follow you on Instagram, and I love your politics, and I love, your critical analysis of what's taking place, not only in your home territory and your country, but just like your politics in general. Like your global analysis is really solid.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this is awesome. I want to get her on the podcast one day. And it just so happens you're passing through, and here you are.
Oh, that's so nice. That is the nicest thing, honestly, anyone has ever said. That's really appreciated. And it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to be here in these territories and to be here and be able to have this conversation. And yeah, I don't know. For me, lately in particular, it's like writing has always, well, I think always, but lately in particular, it's been a way to like process out a lot of my feelings and like what I'm feeling about things, and just a really good way to like write away my anxiety, really. And it helps. It's like informational. I'm glad to hear it's been helpful in terms of getting a better understanding. But that's always been kind of a natural thing, being a first-generation immigrant, moving here when I was like 9 years old, and really being born into displacement right off the bat. So my family moved to Pakistan, or they were displaced to Pakistan right before I was born, a couple of years, maybe a year and a half. So I was born into displacement, and then the treatment of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and the geopolitical dimensions, and moving here. So I haven't really had a choice to be disconnected from it. And that's not true for everybody. Absolutely not. I think in particular for first generation immigrants, the way everybody really processes things is you either are immersed in it day in and day out, or you disconnect from it. And that's perfectly normal and natural, and I makes a lot of sense with regards to identity, because the identity is such a two-edged thing, and it's often weaponized by everybody, to left and right. Single left and right. So I haven't really had a choice but to, in order for me to understand why things happen to me on a personal level, on a daily personal interactions, why I'm here, why can't I go? Why can't I just leave if I'm so unhappy here? I need to do that, and I need everyone to understand that at some level they're also complicit, regardless of who you are. With regards to in relation to imperialism in particular, and not only the military aspect of it, but how people regurgitate a lot of xenophobic tropes and diatribes and rhetoric, and how harmful that is to people who are also here. So yeah, I want to make sure everybody knows. It took me a long time to get to a space where I wanted to share my writing. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, and yeah, really, really nice of you to say all those things.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. It's powerful stuff, and it does speak to me too, obviously, as an Indigenous person who's navigating colonialism ongoing, who has a history of colonization, and obviously, the certain flavors of imperialism that still play out, and just being mindful of my relationship to the world. So seeing your work and reading your work on your Instagram and on your posts and things like that, your social media, it informs me to be a better person. It informs me to be more mindful.
That's so kind. Yeah, and at some level, I know at some point, last year, I was yeah, my personal stuff's cool, it is, but I want to make a very centralized place where I can just solely talk about imperialism and Marxism in particular, but it's specific correlations to Afghanistan and Iran. So a friend and I started the Hulk Collective on Instagram. It's just on Instagram at the moment. It's a collective of Afghans and Iranian revolutionaries who kind of, or at least revolutionary minded folks who want to talk about these things, because in Afghanistan is pretty much non-existent with regards to Iran, it's absolutely militarized, everything in relation to that. So we kind of wanted to carve out a space kind of along the lines of what Anticonquista does on Instagram and Child Collective does on Instagram. And it's been really cool. I didn't expect it to gain like such traction within the past year, but it's been really great to see that people care and want to read and really want to understand the dynamics of how it's not a detached sort of political unfolding in the Middle East or Central Asia or South Asia, but its correlation to what you're fed here every day and how you actually contribute to that structure every single day. So yeah, it's been all that to say it's mostly to alleviate my anxiety about being completely helpless, especially recently. So yeah, that's kind of what I do and where I'm at when I have time.
How do you describe yourself? Like, how do you identify? Like, what's your identity and how do you position yourself?
I'm an Afghan. I've always been an Afghan. And it took me a long time to kind of reach that consensus, not because I ever considered myself Canadian, but more like, it's more of an internal struggle of like being in the diaspora and not being in the homeland, despite being the fact that, I wasn't born here. I moved here when I was super young at 9 years old, and like really formative stage of any childhood where I kind of don't know what's going on, but also very much are aware of what's being done to you and where you are and surroundings and geospatial like recognition and being cognizant of that stuff. So I'm an Afghan woman and a displaced one, and just trying to reach the homelands at some point, and it seems like it's a dream that's always like so close, but something I can't quite reach. And I say that because I actually interestingly booked a trip last year to go home, to Kabul in particular. So my hometown is Kandahar. That's where my dad's from. My mom was she was born and raised in Kabul, but I'm an ethnic Pashtuna, which is like the biggest ethnic group in the country. So I've been to Kandahar once, because I was born in Pakistan and as an undocumented refugee, but been to like my hometown once at 6, and that was to honestly visit my uncle in prison, Taliban prison. So yeah, I really wanted to go home, and finally had like the means to do that. We grew up like very poor here as well. My parents were trying to do their best to manage 3 children and a lifestyle and the basic living stuff, and particularly moving here in their 40s, late 40s, pick up a language, get a job, feed yourself, feed your kids. So never really had enough money for anything else. And even when my grandmother on my dad's side passed, he wasn't able to go and see her. And that was really painful. And there have been a lot of family members, my mom's lost, that she never got to see after they separated in the first time in the mid-90s. So really wanted to do that for myself. I have booked tickets for my dad and my mom to go too. Wow. And then like there was so COVID, of course, protocols, but in particular with regards to Afghanistan, there are no structures in place. Well, we're talking pre 3 weeks ago. No structures in place for testing. People don't really have the luxury to have masks or practice distancing when you're trying to survive daily life. So it was really bad in terms of pandemic, and also like it was also in the middle of winter, and so my uncle who is there and lived there and has worked there for years, he was saying like and very like classic stuff around not having enough infrastructure, but also like power lines. It was the middle of winter, so it would be like a very uncomfortable stay. And I was okay with that. I was like, I don't care, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna I have these 3 weeks, I'm gonna go. I don't know what y'all are doing, but I'm going. And then actually like the airline I was booked with, they're like, yeah, there are no more flights going there because of pandemic, so this is not happening. So I got my money back, but I was really upset. I was really upset. For like a month or 2 months, I was like, every time I think it's gonna happen, like I dream about this, I've dreamt about this every single day since I was like been here, and now like I was like making it happen myself, and still nothing, nada. And my parents were like, just wait a couple of months, it'll be warm, it'll be springtime. And like the political situation might be better. I was like, it's never been good. What makes you think it's gonna get better? And then all these things happen, and it's awful because now I feel like, and it may not be true, but it's like this pit in my stomach. Like I've lost like my one chance to go, and I'm never gonna be able to go back. And it's a really upsetting feeling. to come to terms with, and I'm trying not to think like that, but it's really hard not to. And when you see things happen, not only like ours isn't like news source, we have family back home, and you hear things. I've got uncles on both sides and aunts and immediate family that we're trying to help in terms of not only like sustaining themselves in the city right now. They're all over the country, mostly in Kabul and Kandahar, but some of them want to leave and they can't. And they can't leave. And they can't leave because of the situation at the airport, but also border crossings that are patrolled, and you can't even send money. All the banks aren't operating at the moment, so you can't even help them with alleviating some of their material burdens at the moment. And it's just an absolute shit show, and you wonder, what can you really do? But yeah, all that to say, I consider myself an Afghan woman, and I'm kind of here till I have to be here. And then, and then hopefully I'm able to go home soon one day and kind of do the work I do here at that level. That's all I've really wanted. And being here, I'm 27 now, so I don't know how long that is, not 20 years, 18 years, almost 18 years. Being here, like, and experiencing life here has only solidified that desire. I've never really felt at home here, aside from actually when I'm traveling to non-city areas, non-urban areas, and like places like being here at Poundmaker and meeting people like you and Colby and other folks around the country is the only time I've like felt a semblance of being at home. But other than that, it's just been a giant nightmare to navigate. And that's not just specific to me. It's true for almost all first generation immigrants. And I think people adopt different ways of coping. You cling to your identity in one way. You either cling to it or you cement it and mold to something that you think will be accepted by settler society. But short answer, I'm an Afghan woman living in a settler society, just biding my time.
It's interesting for you to speak to it that way, because for me, it's like I can't fathom not being able to live on my homeland, right? Because obviously I'm from North America, I'm indigenous here, and obviously we have a history of colonization and colonialism, but like we literally are still in my traditional territory, right? Like we're still in this space. And even North America, an affiliation with the Americas and pre-contact Americas and lineages, my heart really goes out to people who are displaced, because I've seen that, especially with some of my friends. I mean, I have friends from all parts of the world because of academia. And then to hear them speak about not being able to experience or live on their homelands, it's always been like an interesting emotional curveball for me too.
It's heart-wrenching. I can't put it in any other way. Yeah, I'm always very envious of people who have access not only to homelands, but elders and language and culture, and don't have to, I mean, not that that's true for everybody, but don't have to really cling to it, like any semblance of it, to have an identity. And then you add in the diaspora mix, and then conversations like, are you even Afghan? I mean, I'm at least I've had my formative years close to my homelands and in between, sort of. But there are people who've been born here, and those who might want to have a connection, it's really difficult. And being like, let's say you're a second generation immigrant and you're trying to learn a language, it'd be really hard for whoever your parents are to really authentically teach that to you. And for you to sustain it would be like nothing short of a miracle, honestly. It would be a very difficult and a very intentional objective, and that's just so fucking unfair. It's so unfair.
Yeah, it totally is. And then at the same time, we're both having these conversations like in the wake of ongoing colonialism and colonization, obviously with imperialism. So we're both like in this shit show storm that was created and generated by certain groups of people in the world. Like literally, I was just thinking when you were talking that like we're literally where we're recording this, we were attacked here in 1885 by the Redcoats. Right. And literally, like, if you look over there on that horizon, I know the audience can't see it, but I'm actually looking on the horizon. There was a column of redcoats with white helmets marching this way to attack us on top of this hill on May 3rd, 1885, or May 2nd, 1885. So it's like there's a relationship we're here. It's so interesting because we're having a conversation in the wake of British colonialism here in this spot. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and I've been lucky enough to hear that story from people, and It's incredible. It's such a testament to a people's desire for sustained liberation and sovereignty and self-determination. And that's why I always found such deep parallels to like indigenous struggles for liberation and that of the global South, and anyone who is really been targeted by colonialism and or imperialism and structures of it, and in pursuit of land, capital, and wealth. So there's not, then that's where the crux of class analysis is, right? And it's really it really is a point that unites all peoples with regards to kind of undoing and dismantling the toxicity around identity in particular. It's like, yes, of course, everyone has a very unique identity. You belong to a specific group of peoples, language, heritage, absolutely. But there's a common parallel in a lot of our histories, and it's really important to recognize that. And it's really important to really analyze things with regards to class consciousness. And it's really difficult to embed that amongst your people, and you don't want to dismiss their experiences. You don't want to dismiss their struggles with regards to poverty, tropes of I've made it here, who are you to take that away from me, and you don't know what I've been through. It's like, no, everyone, we're kind of going through it at the same time. You just need to understand the parallels around like bourgeois liberal usurpation of identity and what the common struggles of your people are, because you hoarding wealth isn't in support or doesn't really contribute to the liberation of your people. And I don't have any issue calling that out amongst my people, or anyone else really. I get shit for it sometimes, but I don't really care. And so it's taken me time to get to that point, because you get labeled different things. I haven't been personally, but I know it's like a very easy like slippery slope for people to call you specific things when you live in such a liberal society, particularly in organizing circles. So
for me, like, I feel like we're definitely in a place where my people, like Treaty 6 territory, indigenous people, are becoming more aware of class now. Like, we're at that point where people have got ahead just enough, they climb just enough to get by, but then at the same time we're still seeing racism, we're still seeing colonialism, we're still seeing obviously this big game play out that wants to dispossess us. And like I feel like we're just like in the next 5 years, maybe there's going to be a more critical class analysis that's going to sort of hopefully like swing things into a more grassroots mobilization, because our grassroots mobilizations have always been I feel have been co-opted by comprador bourgeois class, right? By indigenous comprador bourgeois class, who are in positions of politics and governance, and they always want to go into like the royal commissions. They always want to like have a meeting, and we just end up getting owned by it. So I feel like we're at that stage now. We're becoming more mindful of what our barriers are here. And ideally that comes with a better global analysis and understanding of what's taking place not only throughout history but in the world today. And I know our people are looking at what's taking place in Afghanistan and observing it, but I don't know if we're in a place where we fully get it. Like, we don't fully understand it.
And that's totally okay. That's why I do what I do, really, because I'm like, how, if I like think of it in terms of like, if I were here now we're in Afghan, I wouldn't know what the hell's going on. And it's I think the pinnacle of it is because everything you know about Afghanistan has only been post 2001. So that's not very helpful at all. And you don't, like, no one, I mean, like, it's such an extensive history stretching back millennia, but there isn't even an understanding of the modern history of Afghanistan, let's say, in like 20th century forward. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand what's happening right now. But that's not even specific to anyone living here. It's amongst our own people, like amongst Afghans themselves, not having or knowing history. Of course, you know what has happened to you, but not understanding like the factors behind it, particularly different factors of imperial politics that have been sort of operationalized since the 60s and 70s moving forward. But it's really hard to kind of be like, give me a 101. It's like, I can't give you a 101. I don't even understand what's happening like tomorrow. I can't give you a 101. I can try my best to tell you why things are the way they are and try to give you a perspective of that. And then even when you try to put all the energy in, they're like, well, no, that's not true. You sound like you sound like a communist. And it's like, well, yes, I am. And it's like, no, you don't know the history of communism in your country. It's like, I'm very well aware of the history of communism in my country and how divisive it's been, and how, you know, in the 80s, when the CIA put in operation actively initiated Operation Cyclone, the crux of that operation was to pit Afghans against Afghans and really weaponize like one of our most uniting factors, because the country has over 13 ethnic groups and 4 major ones, but 13 ethnic groups and different languages in each ethnic group. So the one uniting factor post spread of Islam has been your Islamic identity. So really, really weaponized Islam to decimate whatever social progresses had been made by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s, and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, and you make it personal when, you know, you've lost a family member. So, like, personal example, my father is a Marxist. I've got a lot of my political knowledge from him, my leanings, understanding of our country, and I've been lucky to have that, but I've gotten it from him. My uncle, my dad has 10 brothers. His older brother and a beautiful older brother were mujahideen, who were like anti-Soviet fighters, anti-Soviet freedom fighters back in the day, who later turned into not the Afghan population, not the indigenous Afghan population, but the other groups who made up the mujahideen later formed into the Taliban, and then also Al-Qaeda, more specifically, as mentioning with regards to non-Afghan population. Anyway, so a mujahid sympathizer, right?
Yeah.
So when you're in the same room, you don't talk about politics, because we've also had uncles who've been targeted by both sides, as in they had been murdered by both sides. So you don't talk about that shit when you inevitably gather for a family gathering pre-COVID, and like for Eid and family occasions, you don't talk about those things because they're too personal. The flip side of that, when you don't talk about it, no one learns. A, B, it's really hard to deal with unprocessed trauma in your family that like can solely be traced back to imperialism. It's nothing else. And to have to come to terms with like your identity, someone who may have been born here is an extension of imperialism, and it has been directly shaped and formed by it, whether you like it or not, is a really fucking bitter pill to swallow. But yeah, it's really difficult. So we're like, as a peoples, we're still unpacking all that stuff, and we're still getting all these like demands to explain history. And I for one am a huge advocate of political education.
Yeah.
I'm not big on like emotional labor or saying being compensated. Like, yes, absolutely, but it's kind of your duty as a person who wants to advocate for liberation to teach people.
Yeah.
Teach people what you know, share your knowledge, but it's absolutely backbreaking and emotionally exhausting work.
Yeah. And I think like the key thing when I look at what's taking place is the fact that imperialism has played out and is playing out. Like, it's obviously still playing out. And like that's sort of the common ground I feel, is that there's definitely for me, being anti-capitalist, I could see that, like it makes sense in that way. Like, I don't know the nuances, obviously, and I mean a little bit of the history just from like surface level reads, but obviously not enough as somebody who's actually lived it. And just hearing you explain that makes sense. Like, even the family dynamic, right? And I think that really, like, I think was one key thing I'll take away with what you just said, is that there is a family dynamic where obviously these political ties exist, and there is a history of trauma there. And like, even just for me wanting to be more trauma informed, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I could go with that and be like, okay, I'm gonna try and understand this from this position now, as opposed to just seeing what's on CNN or seeing what's on, CBC News. And I think that's the big issue, though, is that a lot of our people just see what's being replicated by Western media, mainstream media. I hate saying the word mainstream media because it's been co-opted by, you know what I mean, like anti-vaxxers.
Exactly.
But it's true in this case. It's true in this case, is that their political analysis doesn't exist, right? Because they're obviously trying to create a sympathy for the first world and for the Western world. And obviously they're not touching base on the fact that they've displaced a lot of people and they destabilized a lot of regions.
Yeah, and it's so, it's not funny, but it's like, you have to fucking laugh when you think about how you've managed to center yourself as like the victim of a military occupation that you instigated. US NATO and Canada is a member state of NATO and has always told a foreign policy line alongside the United States. Yeah, sure, maybe not Iraq, but every other single place, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, you name it. But yeah, it's really funny that, you know, you've managed the success of yourself managing to center yourself, being like, we put in all this time, like you were not actively occupying a sovereign state, and all this time and energy and all our money. What are we gonna do now? Like, let's sanction the Taliban. Like, okay, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, it's really hard. I can also appreciate. I can appreciate the difficulty and the challenge around getting access to news, and it's really hard. And that's the thing, you can't really teach someone to be critical. You can try to present them with information and say like, hey, this is kind of what's happening. Maybe consider this factor, but you can't teach someone critical thinking. It's someone has, like, it's an effort an individual has to actively make to think, and that means the way you shift the way you think about everything, not just like Afghanistan, every single thing. And that's the only time you can actually make the correlation between like political violence and imperialism, and what imperialism is an extension of, and that's like bourgeois class interests and capitalism. And sometimes I even hate using the word capitalism, like as a Marxist, like that's laughable, but because it's been thrown around with such like nonchalance by everybody, including liberals, like, hey, that's a capitalist thing. It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean that's and particularly here, it's an observation of like where I am and in kind of the spaces I've been in, where like on one hand, the very same peoples who advocate for like indigenous self-determination and sovereignty and have taken part in all of these incredible occupations will then also celebrate supremely neoliberal and capitalistic models of governance. I'm thinking of something very specific, but I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm not going to say anything. But and like deals with the federal, provincial government with regards to capital, and people will say like, well, it's still like, you know, determination or control of our own resources. But it's like, yes, yeah, absolutely. But how are you implementing that? How is that going to unfold? And in what way? And are you not legitimizing the settler state at the end of the day by taking part in those processes? And it's really hard to have that conversation with people without identity coming up as an obstacle, being, well, you're not part of this group, you can't speak to it. Like, absolutely, no one's talking about your experiences, no one's talking about your histories. It's like, it's talking about the political process that you're engaging in. And that's a conversation I still haven't mastered. I'll admit. It's really difficult.
I don't think I have either. For me, it's like, it's kind of a bit more of a microcosm, because I do know there's other indigenous people all throughout North America, right? And I think the big goal for me is not wanting to get too general with discourse, or too general and too broad to the point of where it falls in favor to the settler state.
For
that's
sure.
always been their goal, right? And definitely, like, there's organizations of like, in quotations, Aboriginal governance that are serving the settler state simply by being the structure to better streamline power and control for them. And I think I would like to think my audience knows exactly who we're referring to and what we're talking about, because it's pretty clear. And I mean, I definitely want to do more podcasts and episodes on that.
Yeah,
that
for sure.
make that picture clear. But for me, one thing that bugs me is that, and we talked about this even before we sat down, was that it's really hard for Indigenous people to own their politics and even their economic discourse that they want to invest in. Like, people will go about doing it, but they won't say it. Like, I never sat down with an Aboriginal comprador person who openly admits they're a capitalist.
Yeah.
Like, they'll never say that.
No one would ever. Actually, I should have meant that. One time I was at a conference in Ottawa a couple of years ago, and someone was like throwing around the word responsible capitalism, and I was like, okay, this is why I really regret every life choice I've made that's kind of landed me here. But yeah, it's really difficult to have those conversations, but it's really necessary to incorporate, like, no one's asking you to do a dissertation on labor and resources and capital. That's not the point. The point is to be cognizant of what structures are you really supporting at the end of the day. that can be the simple conversation. And once you have that conversation, it is very easy to make correlation to every single geopolitical event in particular that's unfolding around the world, in particular in Global South, because those states have been targeted very specifically for very specific objectives and intentions. And and when you do that, and I'm stressing this point is because when you do that, you no longer have apathy with regards to what's happening in other parts of the world. You will innately have not only compassion but an active desire to join or at least aid the liberation efforts of and resistance and anti-imperialist efforts of other peoples. It's no longer going to be like, it's not an us thing, it's a them thing. No, it's all an us thing. But yeah, it's an ongoing struggle, right? It's definitely an ongoing conversation that's being had everywhere. But I want to say, like, sometimes, and this is something that, people have a hard time understanding or coming to terms with, but you're not always the expert just because you belong to a specific people, just because you belong to even the homeland or even diaspora. Your identity does not make you an expert on politics, and it does not give you a righteous position either. You can have horrific stances on things and still be part of a group.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in positions of political power. And sometimes people outside of your group will have a better analysis of what's going on, a better understanding, a more compassionate understanding, an understanding that really contributes to community well-being and liberation. And that's, like, I don't know, that's the crux of identity, right?
Yeah.
When you weaponize it so much, it's a crutch. It's all you really have, and it's supremely debilitating.
You're listening to our conversation with Lema Ijetmaye, an Afghan woman living in the diaspora. So be sure to stay tuned and listen in after this small little break. I love this conversation we're having because I feel like I wanted to sit down with you and have a conversation specifically about obviously what's taking place in Afghanistan, but I knew we were going to have conversations about this, and I want people to hear it. Like, I want people to hear the critical analysis, the understanding of being critical and mindful of capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism. And I'm glad we're having that conversation because it's like you said, when you said once you understand these big structures in play, you could better empathize and see what's taking place, in particular with the global south.
Yeah.
I think in the first world, people just tend to ignore the global south. Like, they don't realize that there's literal, like, communist banners being flown, that there's literal, grassroots mobilizations taking place that are trying things
and succeeding.
Yeah.
I want to see what's happening. I want you to show me what's happening in the global south that can compare to the scale of things that global south, in the global north, that can compare to the success and success being like a relative term, to the successes of peoples in the global south over the past century, really, in terms of relative measures of infrastructure, improving the material conditions of your people, and doing it in a way that's inherently anti-imperialist and inherently anti-capitalist. I'm thinking of Vietnam, I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of what Venezuela is trying to do, Cuba, Iran, even though it's not no, and anyway, we can get I don't want to get bogged down in Iran. But it's by any means like an anti-capitalist or revolutionary state and no one, I don't think the Iranians would even argue that, but it's an anti-imperialist state that's actively trying to exercise its own sovereignty over its own land, peoples, and resources, and it gets vilified just for existing. So I want to know the resistance efforts here that have been, and I'm talking specifically to people who really like to shit on global South states and vilify and really categorize people as dictators and autocrats and whatnot, and really advocate for democratic liberal values of governance that are inherently oppressive and inherently imperialist.
Yeah. There's like two things there that you brought up that came to mind for me. One is like, I feel like in the first world, North America, like where my people are located, we love English to the point of where we won't even visit Mexico other than outside the realm of tourism.
Yeah.
Right? So we'll go to New Zealand and Australia. And I got friends there who are obviously doing amazing work, but we're like looking for projects within the framework of our colonial tongue. And so obviously we're not looking to like South America and the global South because they don't speak English, right?
Yeah.
And it's also like a whiteness of it. So there's almost like almost seeking out, ironically, interestingly, like a privilege of being in the first world and wanting to connect with other people from the privilege of being in the first world, which is a bold thing to say because I know we're obviously oppressed and in poverty on many levels, but there is that physical dynamic because keep in mind, in India, they speak English, but we don't see any solidarity or any conversations or people buying flights to go to conferences in India.
No, and you bring up an excellent point because you would think if you know the way some people wear identity on an armor and nothing wrong with that depending on how you're like using it, but then if you're going to do that and then to not have any type of semblance of knowledge or solidarity with indigenous peoples of the Americas elsewhere or around the world is like, that's the one thing you're exactly. I don't know that's like the one thing you're gunning for, and like nothing like radio silence when they're actual like literal coup d'etats and replacement of not even socialist states, just anti-Western states taking place, and there's radio silence, and that's honestly a very personal grievance I have with not only just general people but organizers in particular, and organizers and organizing spaces I've been in, and it's the lack of like spatial awareness and the lack of solidarity, and it's not to say that solidarity is transactional, that's not what I'm saying, but it is absolutely fucking reciprocal, and you need to show up when people show up for you. It's not and that I wouldn't categorize as a transactional sort of process or interaction. It's reciprocal. For sure. Because at the end of the day, what you're saying is you don't give a shit about what's happening in other parts of the world. And it's really far away. It's out of sight, out of mind, and their lives don't matter. That's inherently what it is. And I don't care how anyone else tries to frame it.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And that's sort of where I'm at with my positionality too, just in terms of how I want to position my work, not only locally, but globally, because I do feel like we do need a global understanding. And I feel like partly based off even what I said, I think like academia is really siloing political discourse, because that is why we have, amazing relationships with other English-speaking colonies, is because it's sort of driven by academia, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like we're not having solidarity. We're not working with people who are actively engaged in political resistances, which mind boggles. Is like it's mind boggling to me too. It's because like I want to go to the global South. Like I have friends about this all the time. Like the flight's cheaper to Mexico, the flight's cheaper to South America than having to go to Australia. Shorter flight, so why don't we just go there? And so we're investigating it, and like through the nonprofit stuff we do, we want to establish like relationships, and then at the same time, I feel like there's a pressure with first world privilege folks, again, like loaded word, but there's also like this assumption that if you are going to do something political, if you are going to do something economic, it has to be perfect.
Yeah.
But then that's so subjective because who's defining perfection, right? And it's settlers. It's the settler state that's saying you got to do things the right way, but it's not our way. So of course they're going to be like overly critical to the point of where nothing's happening.
When nothing is happening. And it's funny because, you expect that from like people who identify or are active in like right-wing spaces and even liberals, but then when you get like self-identified, I'm using leftists very generally, and I want to include like every kind of identification that people kind of categorize themselves as, but like Western lefts in particular to shit on like what's happening and how global South states govern themselves. And I as an Afghan Marxist, I get that all the time. Like, your government didn't do this right. That's why it's like, what the fuck? What were you doing? What are you doing? We tried, and it's particularly absolutely active with regards to China, but that's like a larger conversation of you feeding into a xenophobic incorporated like industrial complex where you're demonizing the efforts of a state that's lifted 800 million people out of poverty within the last century. That's unheard of. Like, that is, you can't compare anything to that. And then you critique little things that are usually completely false with regards to Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Macau, South China Sea, all of that. And then a lot of the rest of it, it's like, well, you try governing over 1 billion people. I want to see how you approach that. So it's absolutely mind-boggling for sure. And I like personally washed my hands out of academia a long time ago, and it was really hard to do because my parents really emphasized the role of education and formal education in our lives, because that's the only thing that really kind of held them above the line of abject poverty before we moved here, and especially when we moved here. Getting an education means getting good grades. Getting an education means become either a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. And that's not a trope of South Asian folks. Like, I know it is, but there's a reason why there's a trope behind it, because those are the only jobs that pay you enough money to lead a decent, livable life. Not a high quality of life, but to be able to afford rent, like expenses, basic expenses, food, housing. Anything else that, aside from that, doesn't get you don't get to have a living wage. So those particular sectors are emphasized because that means they want you to have a good life. They want you to have an easy life. In order for that to happen, that means you need good grades. In order for that to happen, that means you need to pursue higher levels of education. And that was like one thing I really wanted to do for my parents, like at a personal level. When I moved here, I was like, I need to do this. Otherwise, every single thing they've done will be for naught. Like, I will be the worst child to ever exist. Like, you become a refugee twice. You're displaced twice. You have to restart all over again. You have to, like, learn a new language, come here in your 40s. You don't know anybody. You experience hostile forms of, like, racism every day. And for me not to do what is your basic expectation of you would be awful. And I made it a basic expectation of myself. So, yeah, I have, like, just to put that out there, I have a bachelor's and a master's in political science. And my parents like, okay, yeah, one more level. You get a PhD and then you're done. I'm like, but that's 4 years.
No, it's not 4 years. It's longer than that.
4 years, ideally. Like, people say, like, oh, that's how she was framing it. She's like, it's only 4 more years.
Exactly.
You already did an undergrad. And then when I was in my master, like, I'm never doing another degree again. Not because it was particularly hard. I was good at school, but I knew that's something I don't want to be in. I want to be, I don't know, I still don't know where I want to be, but I want to be in a space where I'm able to share knowledge and that's not printed in a book. Not that there's anything wrong with books. I love books, but I don't want my career to be constant publication and to be in a structure that analyzes people in such a clinical, almost inhuman way, and really strips people of their humanity at times. And particularly in Western context, it's not even like I'll be teaching or contributing to the formal education of my people. It'll just be for like people here. And I don't see any value in doing that within those paradigms. So I particularly like my identity and where I come from and my country is a favorite topic among political scientists and has been for a long time. And to be talked about and in such an external way while you're sitting right there is it's very dehumanizing. And that's something, unfortunately, our people experience, like in the homeland and in the diaspora, because we're here. We like to be poked and prodded here as well. It's a difficult thing for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think like for me too, just like looking even up at in 2001, obviously like 9/11 and being alive during that time, it was really interesting for me just to observe and experience in my lifetime how Afghanistan sort of became this imperialist colonial project again, and just observing that in real time. But again, like what baffles me is our people aren't connecting those dots. And it's just like, shit, this is ongoing colonialism, this is imperialism. And then to toe the line of like first world military tropes are political tropes, and like obviously I like how you positioned how like these soldiers who went and fought in Afghanistan are almost like coming across as the victims of the US pulling out of Afghanistan. And it, like watching CBC News, the National, and hearing them talk, it's like, what the hell? Like, why are they interviewing this whitest settler soldier I've ever seen in my entire life? And why is he trying to give political commentary?
He's named Kyle.
Yeah, it's like, it's wild. It's just wild, and people don't connect those dots. And I really appreciate you bringing this obviously this lived experience to the conversation, but just being real with it and explaining things in this way where this is a conversation we're having with the real person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not Kyle. It's not a political analyst. It's not an academic. Because those are, in my experience, those are the people you tend to hear talk most about Afghanistan. Are either former military or academics or just on the news.
Yeah, it's either like an analyst who works for like, I don't know, I'm gonna throw a random popular think tank in the U.S. like the Brookings, I think it's the Brookings Institute. Anyway, it's never Afghans, and even when it's Afghans, it's imperialist lackeys who've either been in former positions of governance, who are advocating for either like personal funding for themselves, or B, advocating for a larger political project that's unfolding in Afghanistan. Because what's happened is not my mind's like going in thousands of directions when I'm thinking about this, but what's happening is not like a US/NATO defeat and like them succumbing to that or conceding to that and pulling out and absolute chaos like reigning over. It's a calculated plan to position the Taliban into a form of government that will still cater to American. And I say American, this is primarily American. It's primarily an American project, being the biggest empire in the world, an active empire, but to cater to American hegemonic projects in the region. And that's really to break it down in the easiest way is to have a U.S. puppet government. It's just no longer the civilian government. It's now the Taliban. To cater to American interests to really offset the threat posed by Russia, China, and Iran. And so now, again, we're being used as a puppet state again. And that's been the case once, two, this is the third time. And my parents are seeing it for the third time in their lives. And then I just really want to drive home how devastating that is to see your family go through the same thing one more fucking time. And to have like your uncles in their 50s and 60s displaced again, and try to scramble to to find like salvage to salvage their lives primarily, but like a living, and that's the human aspect of it. But I also want to be careful not to sensationalize our pain, because that's being done on our behalf already enough. And I want to make sure it's done in a way that's inherently political and not just a viral one-liner or a viral picture of something that's being disseminated. But all that to say, what's happening there is a very calculated strategy that was negotiated between the Taliban. Initially, when the negotiations began, it was between the Americans and the Taliban. The Afghan government wasn't even a part of it. Wow. So they kind of decided, hey, this is the game plan. The U.S. being like, this is what I want in the region. We clearly haven't been able to defeat you over the past 20 years. So what you'll do, is this like a reasonable thing? If we put you in political power, what you're gunning for, but you answer to us. And that's exactly what's happening. There wasn't a takeover of the country in whatever province or district or village the Taliban were going through. For the most part, the Afghan army under the governance, or military rather, under the governance of the central government, gave up. They surrendered, and there wasn't political the bloodshed that should have been the case if it were a takeover wasn't present. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm not advocating like it should have been volatile. I'm just trying to illustrate my point of how it's like a very deliberate thing. And even the negotiations now, and you have like what they're trying to do is form a transitional government in Afghanistan between the Taliban and former presidents and political figures who were very much U.S. Puppet figures. So all that to say is they're installing a U.S. friendly government, and anything, and all signs indicate of that. I'm kind of oversimplifying it. There's a lot more like political nuance in there, and details and history and who's who that extends like beyond this conversation. But and the point being that we're kind of being used as pawns, and no one really has any qualms about doing that here and in the U.S. and in NATO member states. And then my biggest worry is the influx of refugees, both like internally displaced peoples within Afghanistan, and also in the surrounding countries, and the lack of will on the part of U.S. plus NATO member states to really address that. Because now they're saying it's a Taliban problem. It's not a Taliban problem. It's a you problem. Personally, I've been trying to navigate getting people like some family members and other people out to the Canadian government has announced a resettlement program, but again, it's only extending to people who have either directly help the Canadian Armed Forces, so like actively occupying your own people, or people who have directly worked with the Canadian government. So it's a very narrow scope of people. It's like, yes, that's only going to be people who have connections and resources. What about the thousands of others who are in sheer panic and are trying to leave? And at least drop the bullshit like humanitarian trope. That's the least you can do. And say the way it is. I don't care. I never really cared. And that's how it is. But yeah, it's just really frustrating sometimes to see people talk about Afghanistan, and that's not to say I don't want people to talk about it, but in the way they frame it is very frustrating, and everyone has become an expert on military occupation over the past 3 weeks, when literally we've been talking about it for 20 years and no one has really given a shit. So
yeah, I agree. I agree, because obviously I'm not in the position to pretend to even know what's taking place. But I do understand and acknowledge that Afghanistan is a homeland to a people who have been impacted.
Yeah.
And for me, like, to hear everything you're saying and to contextualize that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, to add to that, and you said it yourself, was that this is the third time, like, your parents' generation are experiencing this, where literally the handover, like how you're describing it as a handover, makes a lot of sense. And it's like, what happened to the last 20 years? But then at the same time, it's like people are still like passing the buck to towing that line of oppressed people can't govern, and displaced people can't govern. Like, there's almost like this first world critique of people being less than, and that's sort of coming out just in terms of how people are explaining it in the media and observing it. But again, they're like missing the bigger picture, which you're highlighting, which you're speaking to. Because for me, when I heard people talking about Afghanistan, it was definitely falling into the avenues of, well, this is what happens when we don't get involved. But that is what happens when you do get involved, type thing. You know what I mean? Like, there's these weird rationalizations and toe the line stuff that's taking place that just doesn't make any sense to me.
None whatsoever. And I really want people to also be in the Canadian settler state context. Everyone to really also be mindful of how complicit the Canadian government has been in the occupation of Afghanistan. It's not a U.S. thing. It's not. And like, we're an active NATO member state, and it's not only with regards to Afghanistan. Like, Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces really also are huge proponents of militarization of other parts of the world under the guise of NATO operation, and really had a lot of the operations in Ukraine and the Baltics in particular that are inherently aggressive. and that's just and I don't have to explain it to people. Like, the Canadian settler state is shitty in the inside and it's shitty on the outside. But it's inherently more violent in terms of like actual sheer levels of physical violence and militarization when it comes to people who are not within the borders of the settler state, because there's not even a semblance of jurisdiction or a semblance of accountability. Anything you do fucking goes. And yeah, I think it's a really critical thing to cover and a really critical factor to consider when you're not only talking about Afghanistan, because that's, in 3 weeks we're not going to be talking about this. I'm going to be talking about this when no one else is going to be talking about this. But whatever else kind of major thing that pops up. And I don't know. I want to talk about, if you want to, or if we can talk about something else, I want to talk about the issue or the premise around sanctions in particular, and how inherently racist, but violent that is, and any type of humanitarian sort of effort that's very limited scope. The one thing the Canadian settler state can do right now is to expand the scope of its resettlement program actively if they want to fucking help. And also expedite a lot of the sponsorship refugee programs that take years already to really sponsor people. You need a certain amount of money to start off. You need 5 people who can vouch for this one person you're trying to get over here. And oftentimes it's immediate family members. It's not like a cousin of a cousin of a cousin. So
yeah, it's wild times, and I think like just in the direction the world's going with climate change, and obviously like destabilization, and obviously like the good thing is people are becoming more aware, more keen. Ideally, I like to think so, and we have to look bigger. We have to look at the bigger picture. We have to really look at the bigger picture.
One day. It's just like, some people can't wait. They're living through it now.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're living through it now, and their whole identities and existence has been living through it. And yeah, it's really really sad. It's really, really sad.
Yeah, anything else you want to talk about? Anything else you want to mention, bring up? You'd mentioned China.
Yeah.
You mentioned China. And that was an interesting take, and I think it's going to be a hot take for a lot of people to hear that, because in Canada, China's bad, right?
Yeah.
In Canada, China's bad, and that tends to be the political line people learn.
Yeah.
And it's wild because I've encountered a lot of white leftists who want me or somebody to take a stand on China.
I'll take a stand on China.
Yeah, it's like, but it's like to the point where they say like, oh, but China's bad.
Yeah.
Right? Like, China's bad. What's your take on China? And I even encountered like some people who are, navigating stuff real time too. And China keeps coming up for everybody. It's like, why do you want us to talk about China so much?
You're talking to too many Maoist Mylons. We don't talk to I'm kidding. Kind of. Yeah, I don't know what to say. Like, okay, I'm discounting liberals and conservatives in this conversation. I'm talking solely about leftists. Okay, let's say the base kind of source of or jumping point is the U.S. is bad. The Western states are bad. They're settler states that either are complicit and actively perpetuating settler colonialism and or imperialism. Like, yeah, you have that foundation. You know that the CIA is operating actively and has been for the past century and a bit, and destabilizing countries, completely ruining countries around the world, primarily in Africa, Africa and South America, and then other places as well, but really in terms of coups and operations. Okay, you have that baseline. And you know that there's a lot of misinformation. Okay, yeah, we all agree on this. And then so how are you still cowing down to whatever you hear about China?
Exactly. You were specifically talking about the baselines that people tend to have, but then those baselines, when you look at the United States, it's like, that's a big problem. But then for some reason, it deflects to China.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm saying that, I'm saying you have like this baseline, like sort of like pillars of what makes a leftist, and like, yes, I have those. And you still kind of bow down and abide by state propaganda. More specifically, U.S. State Department propaganda points when it comes to China. When you dig into it a little bit, it's not really hard to, you don't need to know all the details. It's not really hard to like counter all of those points. So I'm not really sure what the demonization aspect is. I mean, I know, but I don't know why people hop on it so quickly and try to be like this nuanced leftist where like both are imperial powers. You have to be like a balanced perspective. It's like, no, you don't know what you're talking about, because what you're saying doesn't make sense, and what you're saying are either doesn't make sense or are outright lies. So I'm not really sure what the deal with that is either. But it's anything really to usurp and co-opt to really delegitimize the Chinese. And it's been that way because you either see it as an economic threat, as an economic powerhouse, a geopolitical force in the region that has to be countered. They did the same thing with the Soviet Union since its inception in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution until its dissolution in 1991. Literally started so many proxy wars, including Afghanistan, to counter Soviet influence. You don't think the same is true for China in particular? And yeah, so it's kind of mind-boggling. I'm not sure what people like hop on the bandwagon. I think it's this really weird desire to be as objective as possible, really considering both sides. But it's like you haven't really delved into what you're talking about, because inherently at the crux of it, you're literally parroting like State Department CIA propaganda. So you have no legitimacy to me when you're talking about China. And I'm not saying, and it's like I'm not saying China is perfect, or any state, any global South state for that matter is perfect. That's not the argument here. I'll make a very specific example. China, right after Mao's death, had very reactionary foreign policy decisions that it made in an effort as an ongoing thing between the whole ideological divergence between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. So like Khrushchev onwards. Anyway, so in order to like kind of feed into that and in response to that, it made a lot of reactionary foreign policy decisions. In that case, and in Afghanistan, it took a very reactionary pose as well, where they funded and supported the Mujahideen, who are literally fighting against the democratically elected government of Afghanistan, a socialist state at the time, who also weren't perfect, but where they were the state, like the legitimate state that was inherently being destabilized by the Mujahideen. So China also supported and funded the Mujahideen for its own interest at the time, which was to counter Soviet influence, right? And it kind of came back to bite them in the ass, because they sent Muslim fighters from the Xinjiang region, who later formed the East Turkestan independence movement, who are like the literal terrorist group in there that's causing a lot of destabilization in the region. And so it really came back to bite them in the ass. All that to say is like they made really reactionary foreign policy choices, and they haven't been perfect and aren't perfect. But the points that people bring up in order to delegitimize or criticize China are just all imperialist talking points. That's what I take an issue with. I'm not saying you can't criticize the state, but you cannot discount who they are as a state and its peoples, and the resiliency and determination of its peoples to inherently look after themselves and the well-being of their people. And what state wouldn't do that? And what state doesn't do that? I want you to name me one that isn't inherently self-interested in that regard. And to discount the socialist milestones that he has achieved is like, as we talked about before a bit earlier, it's like unparalleled. And so to counter that, it's always manufactured, consented, or cultivated. There's always consent cultivated and manufactured to create an imperialist project. And when you see kind of with regards to China, how it's coming from all sides, it's not like one thing, it's like from all fronts. And it like points to increased imperialist aggression and escalation. And I don't know how, when you criticize China with regards to talking points we talk about specifically, you're also complicit in kind of contributing to that imperialist general dogma.
Yeah. Like for me, I definitely feel like we have to answer for China a lot.
Yeah.
Like, just if you're going to do leftist theory, right? And I know it's nuanced. I know there's lots going on there, and you're unpacking that and explaining a lot of that. But for some reason, there's always, like I said, there's this white settler, or there is this average leftist who's a bit average, like North American leftist, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to say, well, what about China? And that's just what like baffles me, because I don't have the obviously the awareness and understanding you have of the whole situation. But then it's like I'm sitting here trying to mobilize my people, trying to do indigenous sovereignty work, but then now I gotta talk about China, right? So it's almost like it's a tool. Like of course they're being destabilized, and there's a imperialist agenda to destabilize them. But then at the same time, it's like the first world white settler just falls into that simply by just being who they are and what they are.
Yeah, it's like you don't even have to talk about like the political unfolding like situations right now. You can talk about it's colonial period. Like if you're gonna draw a parallel, right? You can talk about the act of colonization of China by the British and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Opium Wars and the complete subjugation and humiliation of its people and how it's worked to counteract that and now is being vilified for counteracting the subjugation and oppression of their people. I don't understand. Like that's a very clear-cut argument and a case, and I don't understand how you can counter that. But yeah, it's something that always comes up. I always have to tackle it for some reason, and I'm like, I'm not the. I don't know everything. I don't know why the expectation is that if you take a Marxist perspective, you have to know everything. Like, I understand it's a disciplined kind of thing. Yeah, you have an analysis. I'm not always right. I don't know everything. I can try and do my best to learn. But the baseline is, to me, it's always confusing. It's confounding. It's like you have the baseline of U.S. bad, but you use the same points that they are manufacturing to say China is bad around bilateral trade negotiations that's being called like colonial projects, colonial debt traps, and which is simply false because a lot of the bilateral trade agreements and loan agreements and infrastructural projects that China is investing in is to counteract the World Bank and IMF implemented projects, especially the debilitating structural adjustment programs where you're first dependent on aid and debt to mobilize an economy and then have to pay an interest and even more money to pay for the debt you took out, which means like your country is in a loophole of poverty, abject poverty, A, B, under complete imperialist control. So a lot of the Chinese investments there are mutually consented to. And I think a lot of the points the leftists make is like, well, it's capitalist. Well, it's like no one's saying it's not a capitalist state. And no one's saying it's a perfectly socialist state. But we're all functioning under a specific framework that is monopolized by the U.S. and its allies, and especially with regards to trade, currency, and reserves.
Yeah.
So how are they, until they make a new model, they're trying to do their best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it because even you bringing up the IMF and how there's this capitalist framework being implemented and utilized, that is true. But then at the same time, like me understanding that global game in my undergrad when I was looking into it, kind of just helped me better understand neocolonialism and settler colonialism internally.
Yeah.
Right? Because they do control us economically. And then you have to subvert that economic control. And I feel like just locally and internally in the settler state, indigenous governance systems don't, and they're not, right? So we're just getting owned economically, and we're becoming subservient to the economic system under the guise of some sort of autonomy. So there's not a nationhood project, right? And then when you do look at nationhood projects and how they try to explain it, it's just basically cut and paste capitalism. Yeah. And they're not critical of the economic system playing out, and there's no control, there's no autonomy. Land backs become like a buzzword, but how does that even look economically? Because for some weird reason, entrepreneurs co-opted land back, and now it's a brand. So it's like, it literally meant...
You're on thin ice. You're having conversations no one wants to have.
Yeah. It's like, it literally became like this conversation of reclaiming a physical space, which would include industry, which would include, things that we need to survive and obviously we need to utilize. But then now it's a brand, and now it's a metaphor. And now it's like, I even literally seen people tweeting and posting that land back doesn't mean displacing, industry or agribusiness. And it's like, but that's literally what's owning us. That like there's literally like on the prairie driving, like all the crops you're seeing go to export. It's not coming to us, right? And we're hungry. We're impoverished people. We have starving people here, but all that grain's going elsewhere. Yeah. Right? Same with the boreal forest in the north or the forest fringe area. All that clear cutting's taking place, and it's going to build homes in the United States. Yeah. And we're houseless, right? So even though we are critical of industry and are critical of those clear cutting practices, there's a certain degree of we're clearly being taken advantage of economically also. Yeah,
and I think that's like you bring up like the the main point of the whole conversation is like the pinnacle is around ownership. Yeah, not in like a very broad term, but literal ownership of capital, land, and resources. And that's the inherent, like, insidious functions of the bourgeoisie when we're talking about capitalism. So unless you make that critical connection, I know a lot of people say, like, what about, like, our communities are dependent on these industries, like, whatever little we have is like a result or a production of what exists right now. But that really limits one's framework of trying to establish something better, something that's not dependent on ownership by the settler state. And then we can get into, wow, I mean, you can speak it to it much more detail than me, around Indian Act and the whole act of, like, band offices and governance inherently and representation. But it all when you own the land of a people and its resources and capital, you own the people. And until you address that in a way that's meaningful and not a watered down, diluted neoliberal framework, you aren't going to achieve liberation. You're just going to, instead of now being a comprador bourgeoisie, you'll be a national bourgeoisie. And that's not really far off from where you were in the beginning. But these are difficult conversations when you're dealing with such volatile instances every day. You mentioned, like, poverty and starvation. It's really hard to have these conversations when people are trying to survive daily life. And I'm very cognizant and aware of that. And I try to make, like, whatever I say, I don't know, as applicable as possible. Like, there's a reason why we are the way we are, and it's inherently due to these structures.
Yeah, I knew you would be able to speak to the big game stuff taking place. And I feel like that's the next step in, like, the political and even class consciousness of Indigenous people in North America, is to understand the bigger game playing out. Because, like I said, you know, that big structure really does play out locally, internally in the settler state. It's just we're not naming it what we're supposed to be naming it.
Yeah.
And we're not identifying it the way we're supposed to be identifying. We think it's normal.
Yeah, well, I can, and I try to, like, I think I'm a nice person. I try to sympathize with that. Like, yeah, there's a fear of isolation. You can be, like, sidelined. You can lose your job, your livelihood, for sure. And I never really am overtly, like, or too harsh or critical of people who are just trying to get by and, you know, just trying to live under a framework we all live in. But it's like the representatives who tout change and still dabble in electoral politics that's inherently colonial.
Yeah.
That's what is really frustrating, because you give people hope. You're spreading messages of hope and well-being, and none of that is being recognized. And I don't know, we can talk about electoral politics if you want, because electoral politics inherently isn't a bad thing. It's an incredibly empowering thing. We've seen in Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, a lot of global South states. That's not the point. It's under a liberal bourgeois framework. The electoral politics are supremely problematic.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about it because the elections are coming up.
Yeah.
If that's what, I mean, I'm not very interested in the federal election. I haven't voted for a while, but we could definitely talk about in years. But we can definitely talk about, like, the different dynamics and tropes you'll see different leaders say. Things like different people will say. I mean, I don't know. And foreign policy is a big part of that. And so is domestic policy, and especially with regards to Indigenous peoples and their inherent right to govern and sustain themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you said about how it's still under a neoliberal framework, the electoral politics. Like, literally, like, electing someone's not a bad thing. Like, I like how you said that too. And then, but what baffles me is, like, just like in my community and what I see with social commentary and political commentary coming from Indigenous people in Canada, some people identify, like, again, making reference to Bolivia, they identify and say, oh, look, there's Indigenous parties down there. Or they elected, you know, Evo Morales, and so electoral politics aren't bad. But then it's like, they're under very clear socialist banners with very clear mobilizing efforts that wanted to mobilize grassroots people that took place over, like, decades. And you want to run for the NDP, or you want to run for the Liberal Party in a settler riding, and you want to, like, tout that as being, like, equivalent to what's taking place in the global South.
There's no comparison whatsoever. And then the act of destabilization that Evo Morales did face and was exiled for, I don't know, a year or 2 years. Thankfully, there was a counter coup. But the coup that took place that Canada facilitated and is trying to facilitate in Venezuela as well. It's like, well, I can. And being part of the NDP party doesn't mean you can absolve yourself from all those foreign policy decision-making. But if you're talking about NDP in particular, when all that stuff in with Sotin was really active, it's still active, but at the height of like political coverage and daily coverage last winter, A group of us organizers in Ottawa, like Jagmeet Singh wanted to meet with people who were organizing a lot of those actions and want to talk about what's happening with Sotin and how the liberal government's awful. And we was like a bunch of us in a room with him. And it was right before COVID, actually. And then I was asking him, I was like, well, provincially, it's an NDP member who's a premier. Can't you speak to, you don't have the jurisdiction to speak to one of your own party members, particularly one who has formal governance powers with regards to dispatching RCMP? And he didn't say anything. And I was like, stop giving me bullshit lines around. He kept saying, eat the rich. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about what's so in actions in Indigenous sovereignty and you dispatching a militarized force to brutalize them. And you're talking about how the Liberal government's responsible for this. And it's like, no, that premier in that province is an NDP premier. And they've still sided with big industry, with corporate politics. And so I don't know how much of a clear illustration there can be with regards to, doesn't really matter the orientation or political platform of a party when you are inherently responsible at the helm of a neoliberal and settler colonial state. You will always act in the favor of whatever actions and policies to sustain that. That's a natural line of thinking. I'm not quite sure why people think a different party would change that unless there is an organic revolutionary movement inherently that usurps and completely topples that system of governance, and that's a different conversation we can have, but not within the paradigms of the electoral politics in the Canadian state right now.
Yeah. I love how you said that. And I'm hoping our listeners pick up on that and take that to heart, because that's the reality. Right. And I've been contacted by the NDP. There's a handful of us who I know across Canada who have been.
Right.
And it's just and people fall for it and have been falling for it.
That's upsetting.
And it's like, oh, this sucks, right? Because
sad.
And we've been talking about it, but we're not really putting it out there, because I know some people in Alberta, British Columbia have also been contacted. But it's just their little tactic they do, and I love how that's why I brought up the NDP, so you could. I knew you probably had a story for it, but they're definitely targeting and recruiting, and trying to get people in their ridings to run, and
it's really sad because you see majority Black and I'm not sure if Indigenous, but a lot of people of color and Black folks who are in the writing, and I'm sure they're wonderful people, and I'm sure their personal politics is great, and I'm sure they personally believe that they are going to make a difference, and that they can advocate for the communities. But that's just not how the settler state was established, and it's not going to be until something happens, and representation isn't going to get us there. And I don't think we should have any discomfort calling I don't know. I don't even know if to say calling out, because there's so much conversations about calling out. But I think anyone should have any qualms or discomfort to talk about that and amongst ourselves. And I don't think even people within their own groups. I think everyone should freely speak about that and not be maligned as being racist or anti-Indigenous or whatever have you.
Or laterally violent.
Oh my God, laterally violent. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just funny because the lateral violence comes up with politics, right? And it's literally, I'm not jealous of somebody running for the NDP. I would not seek to attack them in that way. That's not the flex I'm trying to present. I do not want to run for electoral politics because of this critique, and that's what I'm highlighting.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who knows you should know that by now. This shouldn't be a clear point, but it's a struggle. It's a struggle for sure to make people not just share knowledge, but to make people care enough. And I try to sympathize, especially on a class level, where people are, and meet them at that aspect. And that's where political education is so critical. And I never try to withhold it, but it's exhausting. It's very tiring.
Yeah, it is. So little quick follow-up questions. What do you recommend people read right now?
I always recommend what right now.
Or in general.
I recommend what I consider to be critical pieces in political knowledge, but it's not solely political, but it's inherently revolutionary and really incites that feeling of wanting to pursue a better today and tomorrow and the well-being of yourself and the well-being of your people. I have a few. So I think at a theoretical level, I mean, maybe talk about this. People really shit on theory, but I would recommend State and Revolution by Lenin.
Cool.
Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism by Lenin, and I will like preface that to say they're not the most accessible readings, so like take your time, but they have so many references in there that's supremely helpful. And to get like a better understanding of Marxism in particular, of course, the Communist Manifesto, Wage and Labor by Marx, but those are more like very intent. What I think I always tell people, and it's something a friend told me and it was really helpful, is to read Dialectics and Historical Materialism by Stalin. I don't know if people are going to read that. That's another figure that people have an issue with, right? But I think it's a very, very helpful book with regards to navigating a lot of like terms, and it really breaks down how to look at things and the different, so the lens of dialectics and when things are always in contention with each other, and historical materialism, the material conditions of people throughout different stages of history. So he really breaks it down. It's super short, very accessible in terms of understanding. And then some of my favorites are Men in the Sun by Ghassan Kanafani. He was a Palestinian revolutionary with the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And he was a poet and also a political revolutionary, but first a writer and a poet. And Men in the Sun is a story of people who have just been displaced, Palestinians in a refugee context, and it's one of the most heartful depictions one can have if you really want to get a good understanding of what displacement not feels like, but to get an understanding of perspectives of displacement and political displacement. Men in the Sun by Ghassan Kanafani is really good. It also has like other short stories in there, but the main one is something that I always read and go back to. Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party. Blood in My Eye by George Jackson. What else? And a personal favorite is Guerrilla War Tactics by Che Guevara. It's super helpful. He really literally, it's a very like an interesting contrast to the other books. It's like not political positioning, although he has like writings and speeches with regards to that. It's literally like if you're in a guerrilla position, how to prepare, what to put in your backpack, and what to expect, like a step-by-step breakdown. So it's really cool to read that. But yeah, those are books. I really love, I'm a big fan of speeches and interviews and excerpts. So anything by, Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Agostinho Neto of Angola, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, of course, and Amilcar Cabral of Cape Verde. Those are some of like the basic ones. I try to read a lot of Black revolutionaries, and in addition to supplement a lot of the theoretical works, but also Ho Chi Minh and revolutionary thoughts of Ho Chi Minh. And Mao is great too. I love Mao, but these are like the ones I like prioritize and kind of go back to quite a bit, back and forth. And anything by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. There's this website called Marxist.org, and it has like an archive of like speeches, like short speeches, short writings, letters, a lot of revolutionary figures, and it's all free and it's text form. So I'm not sure if that's how accessible that is, but if you're looking for something free, readily available, that's some of the stuff I would recommend myself. I would thinking about things about Afghanistan, but unfortunately, traditionally our history and the way we tell stories are oral traditions. But with regards to political history, most of it's been written by Westerners. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just from a very liberal perspective, a militarized perspective. So I don't have any books with regards to Afghanistan, but in terms of coverage, Michael Parenti does a really good breakdown of the Soviet in relationship with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, the history of socialism in the country. With regards to that, is a good coverage. I don't think there's a book on it, but there's lots of insightful things that Parenti said around that. But myself, I have always kind of depended on my parents and my own innate knowledge of our people. And got distracted. Being critical with regards. But it's really hard with Afghanistan because there's really nothing out there with regards to books. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have an oral history, and the way we tell stories is we share stories. So. Yeah.
Aside from your Instagram, people should follow your Instagram. How do people find you online?
I don't know.
If you want to be found.
Yeah, I can be found. I don't really put personal info on there. I'm mostly active on Instagram. I mean, like I also mentioned Khalq Collective, which is like a more formal kind of space where you can go read everything mostly about Afghanistan and Iran, but also we do a lot of like theoretical and conceptual Marxist analysis of different things that's happening at the time and kind of correlating it and making connection with Afghanistan. Khalq Collective, that's KHALQ.collective on Instagram. So that's like me and a bunch of other people, team members from like around the world. Yeah, that's like a formal thing. And then my personal one it's in Farsi or Dari. Enqlabi Sake, that's ENQILABI_SAAKET.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice, cool. Awesome. Well, thanks for making time for me and stopping in. You
Oh, my
literally were
pleasure.
driving to Edmonton, and then I saw you on Instagram, and I reached out, and we're literally on the way there. So
I'm so happy you did. It's such an honor to be here and to get to meet you. Colby tells me lots of things about you and and to be here and Poundmaker, and it's beautiful, and I'm really glad my friend gets to see it as well and to see these lands, and we kind of making our way out west and back to be in supremely liberal Ottawa at some point in a couple of weeks.
So welcome to the territory.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, thanks for making time again. I appreciate it. And then we'll talk soon.
Yeah, no worries. Cool.